Okay, hello and good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to the session. Today I'm going to talk about destructive malware and an insight into what I've seen as an incident responder over the last year. My name is Mukund Hirani, and I'm a technical director for Mandiant, and my region is specifically in the Middle East. So I'm based out of Dubai. I had a bit of a shocker when I landed. I didn't have any jumper. I didn't realize how cold it can be here. So I had a bit of a rough start to my first time in Hungary, but hopefully this presentation makes up for it. Okay, so just a quick introduction into what I've been doing. So I'm also a lead in the function of incident response. So I've been with Mandiant for roughly 5 years, and prior to that I was working for the UK government, and I've done a lot of work in Asia, especially in Japan, and following a lot of the common threat groups, especially related to nation states. So when working in Japan, we were following these common groups known as WinT, DASURF, SOGU. These are sort of families of either malware or groups that we track internally and relate to a particular nation state. And after about up until 1 year ago, I moved over to the UAE, and most of our intrusions or most of the investigations we look at and we see groups like Uberos, Tittle, which are more specific to this region. We track things like Frutiama, which are very specific, Newscaster, which are all Middle Eastern groups, and the Equation groups. And we do a lot of work with financial institutions. So you heard about the recent SWIFT attacks in the region. We've done a lot of response to this. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the modern threat landscape here, and a bit about how things have changed over the last 1 or 2 years. So prior to this, you used to have multiple different groups. You used to have nation states, organized crime, insiders, terrorism, hacktivists, loners. These are all specific or separate groups which have now sort of fused. It's very hard when you're trying to identify who the attackers are, whether they're any of these. Everything has been made public, which means people are doing a lot of code reuse. So let's take an example of the US election recently. It was reported that it had Russian involvement, which was targeting the US, but it was more influence. This is something which we haven't seen publicly acknowledged for a long time, where they're looking at an influence op. But then you look at the other side of it when they were hacking, and they were doing a lot more intrusive and stealing data from the Democrats. But instead of keeping the data, they published the data using personas, using Twitter, and a lot of various other things. When you look at other sort of nations as well, so specifically looking at sort of in the Far East, you have the Sony breach. The Sony breach was attributed publicly by both the FBI and the United States president, and it makes you realize that it's not as simple as it is today, as it was a few years ago, to make attribution. There's a lot of things that's available in the public which can be used by both a nation state, an insider, organized crimes like the Russian business network, or just a little script kiddie. So I'm going to briefly talk about the attack life cycle here. Now this is pretty generic, and it's what we see a lot of. So this is a typical intrusion set which we look for. So you have the initial recon. What the initial recon consists of is them doing some homework against the organization. How big is your organization? Who works for your organization? Are these people available on public profiles? Can you find them on places like LinkedIn, on Facebook? Are their emails public? How big and what's the footprint on your web servers? What AS networks are assigned to your core networks? So the initial recon is just to identify, understand, and get a bit more information about you or your organization. We then move into the next phase, which is initial compromise. This is a typical way which they gain the initial compromise by using a spear phishing email. It could be using a web compromise or a water holing attack, or it could be physical by dropping a USB key and hoping somebody plugs it into their network. Now, once the initial compromise has been completed, they quickly move on to something we call establishing a foothold. This is very key. The first system, or patient zero, it's very important to establish a foothold and do the subsequent steps in quick concession. So you install a backdoor or some sort of C2 communication so you can interact with that particular system. And you want to quickly escalate your privileges. What this means is you want to make sure you have valid credentials to browse the network, because this is going to help you in the next step. Now, step one, which is initial recon, can be days, months, weeks. Initial compromise can take a while to occur. But once they're in, the initial foothold and escalate privileges are usually happening within a couple of minutes. And then you have the initial recon. So this is a brand new attacker in the environment. They don't understand, nor do they know your network. So the first thing they're going to do is probe your network. They want to understand where your firewalls are, where your DMZ is. How can they find the sensitive data or whatever the mission is? So this is very tedious task by the groups to understand more of the network. They concentrate on IT administrators or the service desk because this information is readily available and they can digest the information a lot quicker. We then look into something called lateral movement. That's when they have valid credentials. They're going to start probing, visiting these other nodes, whether it's part of the same forest, whether it's a different domain, or there's just a VPN connection. They start dropping persistence mechanisms across the environment, and then they have complete mission. So today, the most important part here is, I believe, complete mission. So when we're talking about ransomware, we're talking about the final act of the intruder, which is wiping, or along the lines of wiping. So in 2017, we saw a big wave of disruptive attacks. I'm not sure how affected this region was in Hungary specifically, but across the rest of Europe and the US, there was something known as WannaCry and Petya, not Petya, internal Petya, however you want to sort of call this particular campaign. So the big questions are, it happened in May, it happened in June, and what was the ramifications? Was it targeted? Was it a political statement? Or was it a particular group or a nation state accidentally releasing some of their capabilities and didn't realize that there'll be so much open vulnerabilities on the internet that will lead to this sort of infection? Okay, I'm sorry, I think I'm supposed to have a different slide here. Again. So we talk about, I spoke about a bit of China, a bit of Russian groups. In my region, in the Middle East, we're targeted against Iran a lot. They're our main adversary and they're the most active group within the region. Now, we recently pulled out a paper. Thank you. Yes, that's the slide. That's the one after. Perfect. So we recently pulled out a paper talking about APT33. It's who we believe to be the IRGC, the group responsible within the government of Iran, and how they conduct their cyber espionage groups. The key thing to understand from at least understanding groups like this is what is their motives. So we know that the motives of this particular group are related to petrochemical, are related to energy, and they're related to institutions which have think tanks. So they have a particular goal, they have a particular mission, and they complete it based on this. So this is their core aim. Now, talking about, and going back to my presentation, what happens when you have ransomware like WannaCry and NotPetya and there's no money involved? So if you remove the financial aspect of ransomware, what do you get? Usually when you have this type of malware, there's an aim. They'll tell you, okay, we want some money. If you pay us the money, we'll decrypt your hard drive, or we'll give you your data back. But in an instance, and what we see a lot of nation states do, is they don't have that motive. They have no financial motive. So when there's no financial motive, when the money's been removed of this equation, we have what we call the shamoon. So what's the shamoon? The shamoon, it's a family, and a malware family we first started seeing active in 2012. It was specifically targeting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and another GCC country. So it was first discovered in 2012, and it was rediscovered in 2016, 2017. One of the biggest things and one of the vast findings from at least the first incident was, it was the biggest disruptive attack we've seen for a very long time. I think it was my first attack I've seen which was disruptive, where they took down a company's infrastructure. This is, in the region of 30,000 machines. So a company wakes up one morning and they notice 30,000 machines are not available to be used. So this is a very big undertaking, and this is what happened in Saudi Arabia. This reoccurred in 2012, 2016, and then finally in 2017. So this is what not this slide. This is what it generally looks like when you have an incident related to shamoon. So you have an attacker, they're going to infect their victims, they're going to move around, and then they're going to brick your machine. They usually do this by wiping parts of your MBR, or they're going to rewrite the disk with a very political message. Now, I mentioned where this comes in. This is destructive malware. People only notice destructive malware when they're in the complete mission. So what does this tell you? This tells you that you have multiple segues prior to identify this. And when we're talking about some of the case studies, which I'm going to move on to, I'll explain why this is very important. So the shamoon, when you disrupt, when you destroy, when you're looking at things like electronic communication, in the UK, there's a Terrorism Act of 2000, and it specifically states in that act that if you're disrupting or you're actually interfering with electronic communication and it's severe, it's classed as an act of terrorism. Now, in this case, when these incidences happen and it's a issue with the company, who owns this incident? Is it the company who owns the incident? Is there their own internal security? Or does the government, or does a CERT, or does somebody other than the company own the incident? Now, when we take this a bit back and we look at general terrorism, if a building in Hungary was attacked, who would own the incident? Would it be the company who's renting in there? Is it going to be the landlord? Is it the bank who finances, or is it the actual government who will own the full incident? At the moment in cyberspace, we have no clear guidelines on who's going to own the incident. Brilliant. So the background. Shamoon, it's a modular malware. What it means is you put its first component or the first stages on a machine and it can download additional modules. Now, it's called disk track. Disk track is a semantic name which they publicize. So if you want a bit more information, feel free to Google a lot of these terms and they'll make a lot more sense to you. It was specific to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, so it's very much targeted. It wasn't a wide-scale attack, and the word shamoon comes from a PDB path in the original code. Now, some of the key components which we know of shamoon, it has 3 modes of operation. So the first mode, which is mode E. Mode E is something we haven't seen being used by this malware family. It's the ransomware, where it encrypts the drive with an RC4 key, and then it asks for a ransom. So this particular malware has that capability, yet it's never been used. The second one is the R mode. So before I continue, these modes are when you install the malware, you can give it a parameter, -E, -R, -F. And we've only ever seen -F used. -R actually overwrites the whole disk, including the MBR, with random pseudo-generated data. So you just can't recover that data. And we've never seen that being used. What we've seen being used is -F. What is -F? -F is when the attacker overwrites the data with a specific file or a specific image. In 2012, this was an image of a burning United States flag. In 2016 and 17, it was an image of a child drowned on the coast, on the beach during the Syrian unrest. So it's very political. Whoever is behind this is sending a political message by giving this type of images and overwriting it. So when you forensically look at them, you understand sort of the background more behind it. And some sub-operations. So it's a very complex piece of malware with a lot of functionality, where if you want to, you can do certain modes of operation. You can find different ways to see what disks are attached. You can overwrite certain parts of the MFT. You can even look at the mirror of the MFT. And one of the key things to note is during 2012 and 2016, there were some bug fixes in the code. So there was a very important bug which made it very difficult for some aspect of the code to function in 2012. That was fixed in 2016, but then another bug was introduced in 2016, which meant it couldn't enumerate shares correctly because they messed up on the question marks, which tells me as an individual that this team has a development cycle. They have a repository, they're committing code, they're going through this cycle of improving the code sets. So it's pretty important to note that this isn't just a regular kid just coding. This is somebody who has a software engineering background. If you look at the actual code flow, you understand that the first thing it looks for is whether this is an x64 machine or a 86 machine. So it's a pretty complex piece of work. And one of the main files it looks for was in System32, copies the timestamps from a file in System32 to apply it to any drop files. So it makes it a bit harder to forensically analyze. The big differences between the two versions is they both use the same raw disk driver. You need a raw disk driver to access the disk itself in the raw form. They don't use WinAPI, so they were using something known as an LDOS driver. They printed a typo and introduced some new ones. One of the great things about when we were analyzing this was we were confused in why they were resetting the system time back to August 20-something. And when we started to inquire and look at the driver itself, we noticed they were using a trial version of the driver. So they couldn't even be bothered paying for it. So what they did was they got the trial version back in 2012 or 2014. They changed the system time to that date, and then they initiated the wiper. I mean, this driver is, I don't know, $30, $40. It's not even expensive. So I'm not even sure why they didn't just pay for it. And the resource name. So everything is compacted into this executable. Within an executable, you have different resources. One resource is the image, and the other resources are going to be related to what it extracts onto disk. So I'm going to now talk about the case study. So in November 2016, we have a call, and this is when this whole malware was released, and they said we have a problem, all our machines are currently inoperable, our business isn't functioning, and we need help. This is one of those incident responses that I find very difficult because we find it difficult to get evidence. If all the machines have been wiped, what can we do? So we ended up going on site and helping our customer. The first focus is always going to be bringing the business back up to operations, and then the incident will always come back and we'll look at a lot of things. So when we were looking at the incident itself, we noticed that everything was wiped. They had no logs, they had no proxy logs, they had a lot of things which were missing from this. So we weren't able to help our customers. Instead, we decided let's help remediate our customer. And during the incident, we will bring the customer back online. During this remediation, sorry, yeah, right. Yeah, down. And again. So during the remediation, we noticed the attackers come back in. So this happened in November. We were working with them in December. And in January, towards the middle, we noticed a malicious document being targeted against the same customer. And instead of alerting or instead of containing, we decided that we want to observe. We want to understand and we want to take some knowledge from this attacker so we can apply it to our intelligence within that environment. So what we noticed was the attacker sent a Word doc to my clients. It was open on a machine and we used our monitoring tools. So we have proprietary monitoring, but the customer wasn't prepared to buy those services. So we set up a very simple solution for them. And it's an open source solution. We used ELK, we used NXLog, and we used Sysmon. So using 3 free open source tools, we basically give them the same capabilities, but it's just a bit harder to maintain. So what we were able to understand from this was they dropped 9 credential harvesting tools. Why this is important is they weren't going after the company's credentials. They were more interested in the user's credentials. So this user was a very high-ranking official within the company, and they were more interested in his credentials, most probably because he won't change his personal passwords, but he is going to change his work passwords when the policy is enforced. And once that sort of engagement finished in January, there was another wave of Shamoon where another 20 organizations had another problem. And again, we were called in for helping one of those customers. And this one was a very different case where we went in, everything was white, but one thing we really noticed was they had great source of logs. So what that means is they had great backups on their proxy logs. They were logging all HTTP data. They had VPN logs. They had a SIM, and they were able to search and query and provide us with a lot of this data. So when we came into this organization, it was very different to the first one. So we were quickly able to identify what occurred. Even though most of the systems have been wiped, using just pure logs, we were able to understand that the attacker came in through the VPN credentials. So we looked at the VPN credentials. It was a third-party contractor. This is very common practice to give you third-party credentials to come through. But what they didn't realize was it wasn't, two-factor. It was giving them open access to the network, so they were able to do as they please. So it came in through a third-party supplier, came into the environment, and as soon as they hit the environment, within 7 minutes, they deployed the malware. So this tells you that this isn't an inexperienced group. So from getting into an account, and 7 minutes later, they deployed and they shut down the company. Now, the way they did this was they went straight into the SCCM server. Within the SCCM, they're able to deploy. So they just invoked SCCM to deploy the malware across every system which they can. And it made it, it was pretty nifty. I mean, speaking from the attacker's perspective, is a really good way and really effective. And this customer wasn't prepared for this. And when we were investigating, or when we notified this MSP in this particular instance, we also was doing a parallel investigation with another MSP, where we were following the same threat groups. And we notified them in late 2016. We started doing an assessment for them in late 2016, and we found one key finding. So the attacker was in an environment and they were remote desktoping around. For some reason, they were unable to bring their files across to their infrastructure. So this particular attacker decided, let me see if my network connection is working. So they remote desktoped from the client to their own infrastructure. It's not a common thing to do, to be fair. But when people do this, they do deploy anti-forensic measures usually. But this particular attacker was slightly lazy. They just wanted to make sure they can access the network. So they went on and they accessed and they continued with the intrusion. Now, when we came in to investigate this particular case, we noticed this. We noticed they remote desktop into their own infrastructure. So the first thing we would do is we look at the cache files. They're called Bcache files, or the caching on what's displayed on your remote desktop session, which means we see fragments of what they saw when the remote desktop in. So using the fragments, we were able to piece together what the screen looked like over time. And one thing we noticed was so we only saw the desktop. They didn't really browse around, so we just had a screenshot of the desktop. On the desktop, this individual wasn't well organized. So you have two types of people. One type of person which organizes the desktop really nicely, and you have the other one who just drops files everywhere and you have random file names. This was the messier type. So we started to analyze the file names. We noticed raw files with customer data on there. We noticed folders with customers on there. And we noticed multiple MSPs. So MSP is a managed service provider. And we noticed the managed service provider, which we done the cases for Shamoon, in and on this desktop, with a lot of raw files and a lot of new MSPs. So what this tells us is there is some connection between all of these adversaries, where they're either looking at the same companies or they're trying to understand or share credentials so they can have easier access. And one of the key takeaways from understanding a lot of this is your supplier chain is very important. When you look at the recent Cloud Hopper, which is an intrusion set by based in China, they only focus on mainly MSPs because of the access they have. You know, you're looking at your big corporations. If you compromise one of these, they'll have access to multiple different corporations with a direct connection in and full access. So I spoke about, Iranian threat groups. I spoke about a bit of Russian threat groups. But what I didn't speak about was the Chinese. And why are they still important in this game? So what happened to the Chinese? There was an agreement in 2015 with Obama and President Xi where they were stopping espionage. And Cameron then also done the same agreement where they agreed to have better laws. And a lot of people said, oh, based on this, they saw a decrease in intrusions from China to these countries. But when you look at the whole political landscape, you understand this wasn't the reason. There was already a strong comment by the president of China to tackle anti-corruption at the lower levels and at the state level. Because a lot of the intrusions which were being seen in 2013, 14, 15 weren't directly done by his office. They were done by enterprise-owned individuals using the capabilities. And that's why you notice a very much decrease, or the capabilities have now increased in a lot of foreign intrusions. So looking at the key points of what would you do when you had an incident like this? You have multiple ways to identify. So the further right you go, the more expensive it becomes to detect these things. So initial recon, very hard to detect and usually not worth the while. So let's move from complete mission. Complete mission is the easiest to detect. That's where they've either stole your data, they've published your data online, on Payspin, on Twitter, or they've done something to let you know. And by then it's usually too late. Lateral movement, very easy to detect. Simple controls like VLANs, the ability to communicate with only who you need to communicate with. ACLs, these all will help you with things like lateral movement, maintaining persistence. Whitelisting. Whitelisting is something so effective yet so simple to accomplish. Internal recon. Understand that these attackers don't understand your network. So they're going to come in and they're going to be slightly noisy. They want to understand what they do within the network. So have specific indicators or have specific rules or correlations based on each of these. You have the established foothold. So once the attackers have come in, they're going to want to establish some sort of foothold. They're going to want to maintain persistence. You don't need any fancy technology. If you run Windows auto runs, it's going to give you 95% of all persistence within a Windows system. If you look at things like scripts or executables like PowerShell which are being used, all you have to do is increase your logging and make it more verbose. So if this attack does occur, you're aware of what happened. I would rather be aware of an attack happening and be able to follow the trail than have very limited logging. Initial compromise, again, is getting more difficult to detect, and the initial hold is very difficult to detect. Okay, so thank you very much. This is me done for today.